That's a lot of people. What's his problem? So today I'm going to be checking out the American Civil War. Feels wrong to be so perky about saying that. In Ireland, of course, we did cover the American Civil War. However, to be honest, as a school child, did I really care that much? No. I'm actually far more interested in these things now, and I feel like this video is going to go into far more detail than the overview that we got in the Irish school system. So I'm excited to check it out. Before I get into today's video, do be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Otherwise, the next time you get in your car, it's going to be really hot. The seats are going to be boiling hot because they're just really hot and your butt's going to stick to the seats and it's going to be a whole thing. So like, share, comment, subscribe to avoid such a curse.
Okay, Mrs. Lincoln, this is it. One last push and we're done. 9 months and 4 days ago, my father brought forth upon my mother himself and gave to her a child, conceived in a shack in Kentucky and dedicated to the proposition that I will drink num-nums from a bottle and do little poo-poos in my pantses for the next 2 to 3 years. Now what is it babies do again? Oh yeah. I am not touching that.
I just want to say once again, I absolutely love the Oversimplified channel. They do history fantastically well. If you want to check out their videos without my interruptions, feel free to go check them out in the link in the description box below.
Abraham Lincoln grew up with his relatively poor family in Kentucky.
Popcorn buckets.
He read a lot of books, worked a lot of jobs, wrote some questionable poetry, and finally entered the law profession. Despite being self-taught, he turned out to be a pretty clever and astute lawyer. In one case,
I didn't know that.
he witnessed a murder at night, and Lincoln was like, "How could you have seen anything in the dark? There was a bright full moon." A what? A bright full moon. Can you say that again, please? There was a bright full moon. A dim half moon? No, a bright full moon. That's funny, because according to this almanac, there was a dim half moon that night, which makes you a liar. Well, I got a bright full moon for y'all right here. Now that's what I call a rebuttal. Lincoln and his cheekbones weren't only interested in law, however.
That was a very high quality picture.
States' rights versus the federal government. What are the executive powers of the president? Is cereal a soup? The founding fathers left some of these questions perhaps
Is cereal a soup?
interpretation. And the biggest question of them all. Thomas Jefferson had written a condemnation of slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but out of fear of losing Southern states' support, it was removed.
A lot of you guys told me that he had put it into the Constitution and then was kind of forced to remove it. Peer pressure, dare I say, which is kind of wild.
Do you think leaving this a little vague will create any unforeseen problems in the future? Cannonball! And those unforeseen problems were now beginning to rear their ugly heads. As the nation developed, the North and the South developed along two very different lines, and two very different cultural identities emerged. Northern cities began rapidly industrializing, while the southern climate allowed for large productions of labor-intensive crops. As a result, one half of the country didn't rely on slaves, while the other half had become economically dependent on them. In 1793, Eli Whitney's cotton gin caused the slave trade in the South to explode, while in the North, a growing abolitionist movement was taking root. A general mistrust began to develop between the North and the South.
I think it's worth saying here, a lot of people say that the Irish were slaves. The Irish were a type of slaves, but they were actually part of indentured servitude, I believe it's called. Well, isn't this a can of worms you don't want to open up and get wrong? Let's look up the dictionary definition of indentured servitude. Indentured servitude is a form of labor in which a person is contracted to work without salary for a specific number of years. The contract, called indenture, may be entered voluntarily for eventual compensation or debt repayment, or it may be imposed as a judicial punishment. Ta-da! They had to work for the American population until they worked off their debt. However, a lot of the white slaves were supposedly treated a lot better than the black slaves. Of course, that's going to be subjective. I'd imagine if you asked an Irish white slave back then, they might have a different story to tell. But a lot of times people say the Irish were slaves alongside black people and the other people who were made into slaves. And that is partially true, but also, you know, there were levels of slavery.
Felt the South were hell-bent on expanding slavery, and fear spread throughout the South that the North wanted to take their slaves away.
We're going to take our slaves.
There were 11 free states and 11 slave states. A perfect balance. A happy medium.
Exactly.
A harmonious relationship. Hey guys, nice to meet you. I'm Missouri, and I would like to become the 23rd state. Hey buddy, welcome to the nation. We'll be happy to
Missouri.
as a free state. Oh no, you don't? You're trying to get one over on us. Missouri's gonna be a slave state. Okay, listen, why don't we just ask Missouri what it wants to be, and we slave state. Well, then, allow me to introduce to you the newest, freshest state on the scene, Maine. Hey, you can't do that, and you can't have any more slave states above this line. What? The issue of slavery is solved, and it will never come up again.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
Hey guys, nice to meet you. I'm California, and I would like to become the 31st state. Hey buddy, welcome to the nation. We'll be happy to accept you as a southern slave state. Oh no, you don't. You're trying to get one over on us. California's gonna be a free state. Okay, listen, why don't we just ask California what it wants to be, and we can free state. Well, then, allow me to introduce to you the territories of New Mexico and Utah, able to freely vote for slavery themselves. Hey, you can't do that! And we can enter Northern Territory anytime we want to recapture escaped slaves. What?
Okay, so they keep changing the rules.
Solved, and it will never come up again.
Interesting.
A few years later, it came up again.
Oh, here we go again.
In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott case that all people of African descent, slave or free, could not be citizens, and therefore could not sue for their own freedom under any
wow.
circumstances, undoing years of progress with this.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Now, within all this bitter debate over slavery, there were many nuances. North versus South, Republican versus Democrat, states versus the federal government. But let's strip all of that away. For 4 million individuals living in America, this wasn't
4 million.
intrigue or party alignment.
Just to put that in context, there are 5 million people in the Republic of Ireland, 7 million people in the Republic of Ireland plus Northern Ireland. So 7 million people in the whole country that I am from. That's a lot of people.
It was about the basic human right to be free. Men, women, and children were stolen from their homelands and brought to the American continent, where for generations they were considered to be property, forced to live in poverty, and work from sunrise to sunset. Plantation overseers did whatever they felt was necessary to get the most out of their slaves. Punishments were often barbaric. Families were regularly separated, and parents could often only watch, as their children were auctioned off, never to be seen again. Abraham Lincoln knew that slavery was a moral evil, and he regularly spoke out against it in powerful speeches that helped him rise through the ranks of the new Republican Party. He lamented at the hypocrisy of a great American nation meant to stand as a shining beacon of freedom, while also enslaving 4 million men, women, and children. He most famously declared in 1858 that a house divided against itself cannot stand.
That's interesting.
America would end. However, even Lincoln was cautious in his opposition. He didn't want to outlaw it entirely, but simply prevent its expansion, so that given enough time, he believed it would naturally die out.
That's interesting. It's a strategy still used today in dissimilar contexts. But for example, let's think of cigarettes. The idea, ultimately, not by the cigarette companies, but is to outlaw smoking in public places, etc., to the point that basically less people smoke. However, something else took over, which is vaping. So, interesting strategy, though.
Thankfully, history would force his hand. In the 1860 election, Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states. But much to their horror, when the final results came in, Lincoln had won by an electoral college landslide. Lincoln himself tried to calm their fear. How many times do I have to tell you, I'm not gonna take away your slaves? Yeah, right, Honest Abe. We've had enough of you Northerners. We're gonna go form our own country. You can't do that. Why not? Well, if you had won the election, would it be okay for us to leave? Of course not. Well, why not? Because that's not how victim mentality works. Many states felt that when they joined the Union, they always withheld the right to leave it whenever they pleased. Many people living in 19th century America often felt more loyalty to their state than to the nation. And now, with the South feeling like it had lost its voice in the federal government, they were out of here. South Carolina was the first to go, and over a period of 6 months, one by one, 11 slave states officially seceded from the Union, with just 4 contested border states.
I didn't know this.
The seceding states issued a number of official documents justifying their secession. South Carolina proclaimed that it was northern states' hostility to slavery that rendered the federal government illegitimate. Mississippi declared that their position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. And in a speech, the Confederate vice president stated that the new Confederate government rested upon what he called the great truth of racial inequality.
Question. So they were saying that they were not part of the United States. They were opting out of the Union. So what were they then? They must have had a collective name, right? Maybe he's going to get to that.
American generals, such as Robert E. Lee, opted to side with their states over the Union. And with all the chaos, one man, watching the crisis unfold, knew it would be his job to solve it. Lincoln was just about to hop on a train and become the President of the United States of America. It was clear Lincoln was ready and willing to get freaky and open up a can of Scatman John if he had to. Whether he had the support of the people, however, was in question. In the end, it was the Confederates that fired the first shot. The Battle of Fort Sumter is considered to be the beginning of the American Civil War. Many of the Confederates there also considered it to be the end of the American Civil War. They hoped Old Abe would just sigh and say, "Okay, you win." Unfortunately for them, Lincoln actually said, "You're about to get a roundhouse to the face." Lincoln sent out the call for 75,000 volunteers, and men signed up in droves, hopeful for some adventure and good old-fashioned F-U-N. In the new Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia, Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cheekbones had also sent out the call for 100,000 men. As ever, both sides hoped for a quick end to the war.
To answer my own question, it was just called the Confederacy. That's what the Confederacy is? Okay. As a non-American, that was always a bit hazy in my mind. But yeah, interesting.
Over yet? No, Jimmy, it's been 1 week. Is it over now? No. How about now? If you ask that one more time, I swear I will turn this army around and you'll all have to go back home to your wives and children. But in particular, the South knew the conflict would pose a bit of a challenge. How can we expect to win with a population of only 5 million against 22 million in the North? If you count us 4 million slaves, you'd have 9 million. Great idea. Hand these rifles out to all the Wait a minute. You almost had me there. The problem for Lincoln was that many of his top generals were getting old and were being a bit too cautious. The commanding general was a man named Winfield Scott, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and by now, he was too fat to even mount a horse. Okay, chaps, we need to come up with a plan. Hit me. We could wait for the Confederates to come and apologize. Maybe we should all sit in a circle and discuss our feelings. Eventually, Lincoln
Accurate.
came up with a multi-pronged strategy. First, a blockade would cut off and starve the South of supplies by sea. Secondly, taking control of the Great Mississippi River would sever the South's economic artery while splitting it in two. And finally, a main Union force in the East would move south and take the Confederate capital, ending the war.
Strategy.
Skirmishes began to break out across the nation, and the Union Army in the East began to move south towards Richmond. Everything seemed to be going well until they reached Manassas, where they came upon a large Confederate force, and both geared up for the first major battle of the Civil War, the First Battle of Bull Run. The Confederates rapidly brought in support via rail, and the two sides were about equal in numbers. However, they were also equally inexperienced. A large number of civilians also rode out by carriage from DC to picnic on the nearby hills and watch the excitement.
Really?
Nobody seemed to quite understand how destructive this war was going to be. The Union
Obviously not.
flanking maneuver to hit the Confederates on their left, and the two sides fired on each other in rows. The Union force saw initial success, pushing the Confederates back to Henry Hill. But one as of yet fairly unknown General Thomas Jackson had arrived, and he took a defensive position, standing firm like a stone wall, holding the Union Army off, and finally sending them running back to Washington, D.C. With heavy casualties, the sobering reality of war hit both sides hard, and the North, having just lost the first major battle, had to face the serious prospect that they may not actually win this war.
Interesting.
He famously loved a long-winded story and a good pun. I've been so busy, my wife...
Me too.
But her aim is starting to improve. But deep down, few realized he could also be incredibly shrewd. Oh, Abe, you're so funny. Funny how? Funny like I'm a clown?
Am I like a clown?
No, funny how? Like I'm here to amuse you? During the...
If you don't get that reference, you're not a true film fan. Funny how? Funny like a clown? Do I amuse you?
I'm funny how? I mean, funny like I'm a clown, I amuse you?
Lincoln committed acts that were viewed by some as impeachable. His administration suppressed the free media from printing articles sympathetic towards the South. Some Southern sympathizers were even arrested without a trial. Lincoln's criticizers began accusing him of being a tyrant. By the end of 1861, with things already looking bad for the North, abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass couldn't believe that the Union Army weren't enlisting black men. He continued to put pressure on Lincoln to make the war
Seems silly.
Mr. President, it's time to make the war about emancipation. I don't want to ruffle any feathers. The feathers are already ruffled.
They're very ruffled.
Hanging on to hope for a quick end to the conflict, continued to fight only for the preservation of the Union. It was decided, however, that escaped slaves from the Confederacy could be held as enemy contraband, and many of these men were put to work bolstering the Union's infrastructure and supply lines. North's one saving grace for now was a general out west fighting in Kentucky and Tennessee, General Ulysses S. Grant. Cool, collected, methodical, and a big fan of whiskey. His chief of staff took it upon himself to keep Grant sober. One officer said that Grant habitually wore an expression as though he were determined to drive his head through a brick wall and was about to do it. And that determination led him to score a number of key victories when others around him were failing. Later in April 1862, the Confederates launched a sudden attack on Grant's army at Shiloh, but the determined, unconditional surrender Grant threw his lines at the rebels and sent them running. The battle resulted in the heaviest casualties in U.S. history so far. And despite his victory, Grant found himself under fire. You have to get rid of Grant. Didn't he win? Yes, but he just threw his men at the enemy. Isn't that the point? Also, he's a loony drunk. Well, what does he like to drink? I believe whiskey, sir. Then send him more.
Good strategy.
As his cabinet did nothing but bicker, and his generals did nothing. But then, worst of all, personal tragedy struck.
Oh no.
Lincoln's young son, Willie, very much loved by the president, died of typhoid fever at the age of 11. Lincoln was a sensitive man and was heavily affected by the loss. His wife was inconsolable. But one of Lincoln's greatest traits, what made him such a great leader, was in the darkest of times, with composure and determination, he kept moving forward. He knew it was his responsibility to hold himself and his family together, and by doing so, he hoped to hold the nation together. In March 1862, Lincoln firmly ordered McClellan to once again move south towards Richmond. McClellan insisted instead they move by sea to the Virginia Peninsula and attack Richmond from the southeast. Yes, said Lincoln. Okay, anything. McClellan vastly outnumbered the force, but it's said that Confederate General Magruder deceived McClellan by cleverly maneuvering his smaller force and making McClellan believe he faced a huge army. No, you have way more men than them. Move forward. No. McClellan settled in for a month-long siege, giving time for Johnston to move south from Manassas and Magruder time to retreat. When he finally entered the city and found it deserted, he declared it a victory, calling his success brilliant. Then, after meeting some resistance at Williamsburg, McClellan moved to within just 20 miles of Richmond, his armies able to hear the church bells ringing in the enemy capital. You still outnumber them. Go give him hell. No. McClellan once again held back, moving slowly.
What's his problem?
Boy, if you don't get...
General Robert E. Lee, one of the most brilliant military commanders of the time, was now in charge. One of his biggest strengths was his ability to read the mind of his enemy, and he knew McClellan was cautious and weak. After moving Stonewall Jackson south to join him, and even though he had a smaller army, Lee hit McClellan in a series of fast-paced, close combat battles that had McClellan spooked. McClellan retreated the Union
7 days battle.
and again, escaping the peninsula and returning to D.C. Lee had defeated McClellan, and the campaign had failed. Well, that was a major success. A success? Tell me exactly what was successful about that. Well, we successfully retreated. You lost. I didn't lose. I merely failed to win.
That's one way of looking at it.
For the North. At least their navy had seen some success, capturing a number of key port cities, notably when they steamrolled past Confederate forts to take New Orleans. And speaking of the navy, both sides had begun using ironclads. So that's pretty cool. But in the East, they still weren't having any luck. After McClellan's disastrous campaign, Lincoln briefly sent out one General John Pope to attack Northern Virginia. Hey man, just checking in. How's it going? Well, the Confederates kicked my butt at Cedar Mountain. Then they raided my camp and ran off with my money and clothes.
Wedgie.
I appear to have been wedgied. But Lincoln had yet another problem to contend with. European powers, in particular the UK, were looking increasingly like they may intervene diplomatically on the side of the Confederates. They were missing their precious supply of southern cotton because of the Union blockade, and they wanted to see a swift conclusion to the war. The tension between America and Great Britain had been increasing, especially after Confederate diplomats were discovered on a British ship. Now, after McClellan's failure,
There's Ireland.
the UK declared it impossible for the North to win. Lincoln needed something to prevent Europe from getting involved, and after more petitioning from abolitionists, he decided maybe the time was finally right to make the war about ending the institution he hated, slavery. If the North had a noble cause to fight for, Europe would be less likely to intervene. But Lincoln and his cabinet knew before they could declare something as radical as emancipation, they needed a victory, especially now that the Confederates were about to go on the attack. Aware that he had a limited number of men in support,
Crocs.
that if he could just threaten Washington, D.C. militarily, he would gain Europe's recognition and crush Northern morale in time for the midterm elections, forcing the North to negotiate. With confidence at an all-time high, for the first time, Robert E. Lee invaded the North. But on September 13th, the North finally had some luck. Oh boy, it's my lucky day! A cigar in a field. Hey, what's this wrapped around it? Oh my gosh! That's right, the North had discovered General Lee's battle plans wrapped around some cigars. And in them, they saw that Lee had split up his forces. McClellan headed out from D.C., and the two sides met in the Battle of Antietam, a crucial battle that would decide the course of the war. It saw the most vicious fighting to date, and still remains the
Okay, there's Pearl Harbor.
in history. But for once, the North came out victorious, and Lee was forced to retreat. North had won their crucial victory. Lincoln breathed a huge sigh of relief, and with that win, he was prepared to take a huge step. On September 22nd, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. In January, all slaves held in the Confederate States would be, as far as the US government was concerned, officially free. Throughout the North, free black men and women rejoiced, knowing that if the North were to win, their brothers and sisters would no longer be held in bondage. The proclamation also had the intended effect on Europe, who were not willing to oppose a pledge to end slavery. An outraged Confederacy knew that Lincoln had given the war a new meaning. It was no longer just about the preservation of the Union. Now, it was about creating a new Union, washed clean of its original sin. A Union without slavery.
That was super interesting. There were loads of things I didn't know how they happened, and they explain things so well on that channel. I absolutely love it. If you guys do want to see me do part 2, let me know below in the comments, and depending on demand, I will or will not do it. Thank you so much, guys. That's it for today. See you on the other side. Bye. What? There's no bloopers today, because she's perfect.